All right, we're recording. This is Service API's office hours for July 22. And it looks like we've got plenty to talk about. I'll get started. Actually, Jonathan, it looks like you're on the call. You'd mentioned in Slack that maybe we should look at supporting other protocols, and you have referenced this doc. Do you want to give us a bit of a background on what on this proposal?
Yeah. So, hi everyone. I'm new to this group, so forgive me for my my unfamiliar face and name. But I'm working on an IoT startup, and we are trying to implement different IoT protocols as part of our backend. That story is not really relevant, but it began me on this journey of sort of surveying the latest landscape around networking and routing, and just sort of how it is that protocols are implemented. First on the Kubernetes level, as well as other things around it. And it snowballed into this doc, which I've presented to the networking SIG and other network related groups of, hey, there's some opportunities to improve stuff. And I can send a link to the video recording for some of those presentations. But the TLDR is the cloud-native world is optimized for HTTP, which is awesome and important. But if you're trying to build high performance, high scalability, reliable services with other types of protocols, it becomes a little bit dicey. You end up rolling a lot of your own things and working around the built-in primitives. And so I just thought, hey, I've been hearing about the new services work, and I'm super curious. And then I saw there's office hours, so I was like, hey, maybe raise awareness and see if there's anyone who's interested in this topic, or maybe can help contribute and drive the direction in subsequent releases. And so when I say new protocols, HTTP, HTTP2, HTTP3, Quick, those are protocols, but also other protocols that might be found in IoT would be CoAP or MQTT. In gaming, or there might be some other sort of game state protocols. In telephony, it might be WebRTC. So kind of reeling back to my TLDR, this doc is a collaboration with a bunch of different folks, including some contributors to different projects across the CNCF landscape as it relates to specifically networking type stuff, workload. And just surveying a particular project that might be really relevant, or a spec or a KEP, and say, hey, this would actually improve things because it does X, Y, and Z, or this project is not prioritizing non-HTTP protocols. That's cool, and let's keep track of it, kind of thing. And so I rambled probably longer than I planned on, but one, I just wanted to bring this awareness of alternative protocols, and there's a growing interest among different verticals and industries, and seeing if there's something relevant here to look at, and can maybe even contribute use cases for the evolution of the services API.
Yeah, thanks for that background. That's very helpful. And I know, like we've already discussed, that the scope for V1 Alpha 1 likely won't include any of these additional protocols, but I think it's useful to at least be thinking about how service APIs could potentially support more protocols than than just the basic TCP, UDP, HTTP, HTTPS, the very basic protocols that we've had initial design or support for. You mentioned here further down in the doc some references to SMI, some references to Envoy. How have you found this this relates to those other technologies?
Oh, so it's sort of this incremental, sort of like life of a packet, if you will, for ex-Googlers in the room like myself. If you're building like a service mesh implementation, and you want to have observability or circuit breaking, or even just integration at the auth-in, auth-z layer of a particular service mesh. Specifically calling out Envoy and SMI, there are explicit points of extension. And I think that's the general theme I've been picking up on, and I think this is the right theme of make the HTTP protocol rock solid, have a bunch of custom functionality around HTTP, and then leave some breadcrumbs where the minority protocol implementers can go ahead and hook it into. So for example, in Envoy, they're moving towards a model where you can extend through, WebAssembly modules, but those modules can kind of do any sort of logic you might be able to do if you were to customize the C++ code base. So that allows you to implement observability for a particular unique protocol, deploy that with an off-the-shelf build of Envoy, or enterprise supported package, etc. So that's kind of like the analysis that on Envoy. On SMI, they have the concept of trying to remember the exact language, traffic, and a traffic spec maps one-to-one to a particular protocol, and they've written traffic specs for HTTP and TCP as far as I remember. And the very intent of it was to write, for allow other implementers to go and define their own traffic specs kind of thing. So it's sort of that spectrum of, it's actually in the spec, and here's a thing we want to spec out, and that'll be part of some implementation, or it's truly just extension points that we leave up to the implementer to figure out how to do it. And that's also true in other projects or components, right? Like even on the current Ingress implementation, doesn't really care what protocol it is, but there are some conveniences and sort of annotations is the wrong word, but things you can write into the YAML file that says, hey, this is TCP traffic and you should treat it this way. That sort of, I think that answers the, how does this all relate? And if you go across different projects, and there's probably a project level kind of comparison, each one has some sort of networking thing, and they have some assumption that all the networking traffic is going to be HTTP, and so therefore they build all their tooling around that. We don't talk about like tracing or other forms of observability, but again, like other projects like OpenTelemetry also is very hard and fast around HTTP and a few other more common protocols.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think we would probably have a good parallel here with the SMI implementation you're referring to here. The pattern they have of traffic specs being a one-to-one mapping with a protocol would be very similar to our route CRD right now, which we have a TCP route, an HTTP route, and it so far has been a one-to-one mapping to protocol. And I think there's space, and I think that's intentional, to allow custom routes in the future. But I don't know how well we've spec'd that. Well, actually, I'm pretty sure we have not spec'd that out. It's certainly unwritten, but it seems like something that would be fairly easy to create your own route types and make them work with this API. This is really helpful.
Awesome. Yeah, and James just posted an example to the SMI spec, and he was actually helping me out in the Slack group. There's probably the foundation and some of the cement is laid down, but probably the details have to be worked through. And I'm happy to contribute more examples and maybe even some concrete ones as we work through our own future architecture, whenever that's helpful.
Hey, Jonathan, in the SMI spec, when you use things like HTTP route group, what resource references these these CRDs?
Right, then I got a lock screen. Sorry about that. I'm actually not an expert on how the routes are implemented. I've just been bringing it up within the SMI group.
Okay, I'll go do some reading on that, because this is the first time I've seen HTTP route group, and it does look like it's moving in a very similar direction to what we have in service APIs.
Yeah, and I felt the inverse, having digged around a little bit there, and then I saw the route group. I was like, oh, great, these are compatible and sort of aligned directionally.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the meeting got recorded, but there was a helpful meeting where one of the SMI maintainers came over to one of our either office hours or weekly meetings to kind of provide a background to the design decisions they made. That was primarily related to traffic split at the time, but we ended up digging around a bit further and discussed route group. I don't remember the date on that. I think Damien actually organized that. I don't know if you know when we did that, but there was
Remember the
some good
specific data.
discussion.
I do recall it was a couple months ago, and there is, or there should still be, an issue in the SMI spec repo that talks about this kind of overlap between SMI spec and service APIs. So yeah, I mean, Jonathan, it's probably worth digging that recording up. If I could find it, I'll send it to you. But I'd also look into that issue, and I'm going to look for that as well and post it in the chat here if I could find it.
Awesome.
Yeah, and as I recall, they were very open to collaborating, and their idea was they created this spec because there wasn't something like upstream, but if there was something like upstream, they would happily use that instead. So wherever we can overlap, whatever we can, yeah. Well, I think our conclusion at the end was it provided some interesting pieces, but it didn't provide the full end-to-end kind of framework that we're looking for. Like, it provides route groups, but it doesn't, at least as I'm remembering it, it didn't provide any kind of alternative to, say, a gateway resource. It's been a minute, but that's how I remember the conversation going.
So where we are today in the listener, in the gateway listener, with regards to extending the protocols, is that the protocol type field is fixed. There's only 4 possible values there today: HTTP, HTTPS, TLS, and TCP. And I think there's an issue, and we've talked about making that, allowing arbitrary protocol type strings in there, which could be something useful for the IoT protocol suites. The other extensibility is the routes and the route binding selector. Number of people have discussed with me that they want to select services directly there, and so I think it's likely that people are going to implement that, and we'll try and get them to bring their implementation experience back to the working group and see how it went. For IoT and gaming protocols that layer on top of one of the 4 fundamental protocol types, you could do a similar sort of thing. So if you know that some protocol runs over TCP, then you could set the protocol type to TCP, and then you would bind a route selector with whatever your upper layer protocol is semantically.
And I think that makes a lot of sense from a implementer's perspective. Like, you want to have a solid layer 4 basis, so you just implement the layer 7 protocol. Interestingly enough, a lot of the protocols are UDP based on the IoT side, on the gaming side, and the telephony side. So that might be a gap.
Yeah, I think definitely there's a lot of interest in adding UDP to the fundamental protocols. At least for me, I don't have that really any operational experience to have a strong point of view about what the semantics of that would look like. And I expect that you really want to use UDP, the fundamental UDP protocol type, in conjunction with a route protocol type, which brings in those session-based semantics or protocol, like says what you're actually doing with UDP, because UDP packet forwarding by itself is not necessarily that. It's more like a network function maybe than a proxy function.
Totally agree.
Cool. That's helpful background. And yeah, I admit I'd forgotten that part about the listener protocol being hard coded and limited right now. But that's yeah, great point.
But that might be. I mean, it might be sufficient just to say, okay, we add UDP to the protocol type, and then if you're going to use this, then you need to then the controller needs to understand the relationship between the protocol type and the specific, route bindings that get selected for that.
Yeah, I think we'll have to have some room to extend protocol, like to have some concept of extended protocols on Gateway Listener, because I imagine this will be a somewhat common request to have more protocols supported than our core. So that makes sense.
And even just for future protocol development, right? When HTTP 4 comes out, it'd be ideal to start with a custom HTTP 4 implementation to test the waters and design.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, so just for background, the reason we do have like a fixed protocol type is so that we can have meaningful spec language about how virtual hosts layer onto this thing. Because if it was all completely abstract, then you wouldn't necessarily be able to say anything about how TLS, HTTPS, and HTTP interact, because those concepts wouldn't really exist.
Right. Yeah. So it's almost like we need those core types that are very well defined, and then some extension points or something to for the more experimental implementations. Cool. All right. Well, James, I think you had the next item on the agenda, and I just pulled this because we didn't have enough time last week to discuss this. But if you'd rather move this to our full meeting tomorrow, I can leave it for that too. It's up to you.
Let's leave it for the full meeting tomorrow,
Okay.
because I think it's a short topic. It's just something
Yeah.
to bring to people's attention, and
Just-
when we have more people there, it'll be more.
Yeah,
better.
that makes sense. All right. Well, that works out well, because the last part of this, I wanted to go through conflict resolution, and I imagine this being almost like a working session. I don't know, but I have a doc that hopefully is a decent starting point here around conflict resolution. Obviously, I am very interested in trying to get, I think we're all interested in trying to get a V1 Alpha 1 release of this API out. And conflict resolution is one of the things on that list that we wanted to have well defined as part of a initial alpha release. So with that background, I'd taken on an action item to just try to provide a starting point and try to spec out what this should look like. Some of this is a follow-up to probably an office hours a few weeks ago where we discussed this briefly, but I've added a lot more detail. I've added a lot more potential conflict scenarios. And I wanted to spend some time just working through each of these potential conflicts in a relatively informal way, and seeing if the proposed solution I have suggested makes sense, and maybe more importantly, trying to identify conflicts that I haven't listed yet, because I know they exist. I know this is still an incomplete list, but yeah, it's a starting point. So first off, the guiding principle is the one that we identified before that I think just about everyone was in agreement with, was let's prefer to not break things that are already working. I think that's a brilliant first principle. Then I've added that we want to provide a consistent experience when conflicts occur. So even if it may not be something that makes people happy per se, at least it makes sense. At least it's consistent, and you can understand why a decision was made, and maybe even more importantly, it's consistent between implementations. Then we want to make sure it's clear which path has been chosen when a conflict has been identified. So when there are multiple matches, as an example, we want it to be clear that either one was not chosen or one was chosen, but to find a way to identify the decision that was made in a way the user can understand. And then more specific matches should be given precedence over less specific ones. I think this is a really old, non-controversial guiding principle, but I just wanted to have that in here because it seems to be a theme that will come through in all of these different conflicts. But before I go any further, do those principles make sense? Is there anything that I should add here as another potential theme?
I think you've captured a good set of principles there. I think it's
Cool.
I think it hits everything. It's great.
Great, thanks. So the first one I wanted to get into is, let's say that we have gateway listeners in separate gateways that both match the same host name. Now, obviously, this is going to depend on the implementation. There are some implementations where, say, cloud, a gateway will represent a load balancer, likely a cloud load balancer. And so DNS is going to point to a specific IP, and you don't have probably quite the same issue with this conflict. But there are a number of use cases where it may not be that clear. And so I've proposed a solution that may or may not make sense. Obviously, first off, if there is one match that is more specific than the other, that should always be given precedence. I think that just makes sense. But if both of these not only match, but they match identically, like the actual match is identical, equally specific, my idea was that precedence should be given to the oldest gateway based on creation timestamp. I know there's been a lot of issues trying to identify what was most recently changed, which might be ideal, but going with something like the oldest resource is going to give you, well, I think, the most consistent experience. You would hate to get into a world where updating a resource makes it gain precedence because it's now the most recently changed or whatever that happens to be. And that assumes that you even have a way to identify that. We do have access to creation timestamp. So if we can use that as a matter of giving precedence to the older resource, I think that makes sense here. And then finally, if both have equivalent creation timestamps, if you get another tie there, one thing that we know will always be unique is the namespace/name combination for a resource. So my suggestion was to give precedence based on alphabetical order based on that namespace name string. That is a real stretch. That is not particularly intuitive, but it is consistent. And that should resolve any potential conflicts. I can't think of anything going past that set of conditions. That's maybe a little weird. Does that order of operations seem to make sense, specifically the oldest creation timestamp?
Yeah, I'm in favor of the oldest creation timestamp. I do question whether if both gateways have equivalent creation timestamps to use the namespace name, as opposed to just throwing an error. Just trying to understand like how applicable that would be, that that a user would actually want to use the gateway that's listed first in alphabetical order. I think it may cause more harm than good, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
So what would that error look like? So what I'm concerned about is, so yes, I guess if they do both have equivalent creation timestamps, I guess a concern is, let's say they both have equivalent creation timestamps and one gateway is updated accidentally to match a given host name, let's say. I guess you're going to break anyway. But the potential accidental impact there is if you update and set a host name match that you didn't intend in one with an equivalent creation timestamp, you could potentially make that other gateway completely invalid, which I suppose is true here. But I think what you're suggesting, Damien, is making both gateways invalid and not routing, like basically not routing traffic to either one. And what I'm suggesting is just picking one and routing traffic to it. And in this case, it's picking based on alphabetical name.
I see what you're saying.
And so, yeah, so I guess that's, I'm trying to line up with this prefer not to break things that are working idea of, if we have at least one valid path, we'll choose it, and we'll choose it in a consistent way. Even if it's a strange way, it's consistent. My hope is that we never get to this if both have equivalent creation timestamps. That does seem like a bit of a stretch, but you know, it could happen. I don't know. I get that last is probably not desired behavior. I'm just trying to think of the least bad option here. You know, I hate the idea of, okay, this is invalid. Let's just consider both gateways broken, or both listeners broken.
Can I work through a concrete example and make sure I understand?
Yeah.
Just say maybe for discussion too. So,
Yeah.
you know, I've got two gateways, gateway 1 and gateway 2. Gateway 2 or gateway 1 was created before gateway 2. But I go in and I create, you know, host name for gateway 2 for foo.example.com. Everything's working. I then at some point in time in the future go to gateway 1 and use that same host name. In this scenario, we're basically saying is that although gateway 2 is created or was created after gateway 1, and was working just fine, I go into gateway 1 and accidentally add the same host name, and now gateway 2 stops. That host name stops working for gateway 2, and it works for gateway 1.
Yes, unfortunately, I think that's the case because gateway 1 happens to be older in that case. I can't think, I hate that outcome, but I can't think of a reliable way to diff based on last updated time and not just have a really confusing and inconsistent experience. And I think the only other alternative is to just consider them both invalid, which breaks everything consistently. So it's consistent, but it's really harsh.
Yeah, and I think that would be the last option, is just to, you know, break everything, like you said, that one guiding principle. But I do feel like most of the time it's like a user goes in and it's like that last updated or the latest change is the incorrect change.
Yes.
And so it does seem like, okay, this approach here that you're proposing is it better than breaking everything? But I do think it's actually could cause more, you know, undesired consequences, even though it doesn't break.
You're right in that it could hide an error or just really confuse a user.
Well, that's the first principle, right? Prefer not to break things that are working.
Yeah.
So if you had something working and then you made a change which would break the working thing, but would also supersede the working thing due to this rule, then that would violate that first principle.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the complicated fact, as far as I know, there's not a great way to know when the breaking change was added. And especially like if you have a long running controller, you can try and remember that state. But if a controller is starting up fresh or had to restart for some reason and just has to view the state as it knows it, it feels like it would be very difficult to derive that information, to understand what introduced the breaking behavior.
It is. We have this problem. We have this exactly the same issue. It's identical issue in Contour because it's not easy to inspect Envoy to see what it's. You can't. The XDS doesn't really say let you say like what is your current state. So you can't start up. You can't have your controller start up, inspect an Envoy, and then match that state back to what you see in CID resources. So you can keep track of it internally while you're running and do the right thing, but then if you have to restart your control, then you've lost all state and something, and you can end up in this sort of situation.
Yeah, and I think that's another case we would want to avoid, and that kind of goes back to the second guiding principle I have here: providing a consistent experience when conflicts occur, and trying to do something that's not going to rely on temporary state, trying to do something that is something that can persist over restart without any kind of temporary state stored by the implementation. Maybe there's another way, because I will say I don't love this option, but I don't like any of the other alternatives either.
For this specific case, I guess my 2 cents is that I would never enforce this conflict. I would treat this case as implying that some operator wanted to do round robin DNS.
Okay.
So I think for many implementations, this particular conflict could be just moot.
That's a great. So yeah, I'll have to add that to the note above too, because for cloud implementations, this is moot almost all the time, assuming that gateway is a one-to-one representation of the cloud load balancer. And for others, I would imagine that, I guess that's not necessarily true. It's almost always moot for a cloud, but in your use case, for other implementations, a round robin approach might make most sense. I wonder, yeah, I mean, that is certainly one of the cleanest approaches here.
I mean, one thing we could do is just to say this is not a conflict.
Yeah, I have that below for another potential conflict. Okay.
And James, that is a great point that I could see, that this use case, used quite often.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder if there are real limitations among implementations where it would not be possible or would not be straightforward to do some kind of round robin approach between listeners. If it would complicate the implementation, maybe. Yeah. Well, I'll leave that up there for further comment, but that is a great point. Okay. And then the next one is incredibly similar to this, and it's before I go further, Damien, were you going to say something?
No.
Okay. Gateway listeners within a gateway both match the same host name. So this is very similar, but it's saying instead of spread across multiple gateways, this is within the same gateway, so it's not based on gateway name. We could potentially handle this with validation if we want. We could say that host names must be unique within a gateway. Within a gateway, listener host names must be unique. Or alternatively, we could do some weird conflict handling, or finally, we could take James' potential solution here of just, if there are multiple listeners with the same host, assume round robining. Does one of those options sound better than the other?
So this is the case where you've got the host name in more than one listener because you're trying to configure some sort of virtual hosting, but our rules don't allow that configuration to be, or your implementation can't kind of collapse that down into a single virtual host.
Yeah, potentially, or maybe, yeah, maybe it can just be collapsed down into a single virtual host. Yeah, that's cool. Okay.
This I think sounds like a I think it sounds like a validation error to me, because this is within one single gateway, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so is there ever a point where this is something that we want to allow, where a host name is present, it is identical within multiple listeners on the same gateway?
Sorry, could you ask that question again?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so do we ever want a set of gateway listeners within the same gateway to have the same host name? Or is that just always invalid?
I think it can happen. I think it can happen because you could have a HTTPS, because you can have it on different protocols, right? You could have an HTTPS listener and an HTTP listener with the same host name.
That's fair. But within the same protocol. So this is still something that validation can handle for us. If we say that host name must be unique, that the combination of host name and protocol must be unique for a listener within a gateway. Yeah,
there are ways to specify it which you'd expect would generate an error. There is a condition port conflict for listeners, which you could say that you could kind of flip the error around and say, oh, you're not actually conflicting on host name. You specify two host names, therefore those host names are conflicting on port. But maybe it's better to have a more specific error to say, like, you're conflicting on the name.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anything that we can solve with validation, I prefer, because anything else is going to be much more confusing to a user than things that we can solve up front with an error message as they're trying to update or create their config. Yeah.
Is a validation webhook something that the working group could ship as a standard?
That is what I would recommend, and I have some potential conflict resolution recommendations below that rely on a webhook as well. And I think at the very least, we need to provide, I think it would make sense to have a common set of code for this. I think anytime you try to deploy a validating webhook, it's a little bit messy. At least in my experience, getting TLS, everything else. So maybe the actual deployment of that webhook is something that implementations help with. But I think it would make a lot of sense to make that shared code tied with the API.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Cool.
Rob, there for option 1, you say validate that host name plus listener value is unique.
Thank you. Host name plus protocol. It is what I meant. Thank you. Does that make any more sense?
That does, but I do question whether it maybe needs to be, or we need to consider port as well. I think you could kind of go along the same use case that James described with exposing an application via HTTP and HTTPS. I think you could also do the same where you say, it's an HTTP app, but I expose one port for one reason and another port for another reason. It's probably less common, but I don't know what you guys think about also including port.
So
Yeah,
how
I think it could
interpret.
be. Sorry, Rob, go ahead.
How I interpret what you're suggesting here, and I think it makes sense, is host name should be unique. You should never have the same host name for same values of protocol and port. But you could have a host name with a identical port and different protocol, as an example. Well, no, that doesn't make sense. You want all three to be, yeah.
Okay, so from the spec, we have listeners are compatible if all the following conditions are true. Their protocol fields are HTTP, or all their protocol fields are HTTPS or TLS. Their hostname fields have a match other than any. There's like 3 rules.
Okay.
But I think you're right. It'd be great to have something validate a common component to actually validate these rules so that all the implementations end up doing roughly the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense because I remember reading through that spec and it is fairly clearly defined. We just need to actually validate it.
It's kind of clear but complicated at the same time.
Yeah. And with all these things, it's a lot clearer if you just get an error message when you try and do something and it isn't right, as opposed to getting some weird status condition and having to look for that on your resource. So yeah, cool. All right, so gateway listeners share the same port. I think this is going to end up being the same thing all over again as above, because this is the same discussion, I believe. Multiple routes match the same path. This one is a bit, maybe a bit trickier. It could be what James had mentioned above for gateway, of just if you have multiple routes, you could round robin between them if multiple routes match. My naive initial proposed solution was very similar to a solution I proposed above, which gives precedent to most specific first. I think that always wins. And then after that, oldest, and then after that, alphabetical. But I am especially less convinced that alphabetical makes sense. I don't know about the round robin between matching routes. That may also be strange. I don't know. Is there any precedence for something like that where you'd round robin between different routes here? Would that feel natural, or would that be something like anyone ever intended? I'm at least going to jot down that we could consider cool. And James, I noticed you added a condition port conflict here. Do you think there's any case where we would need a condition if validation, like, is there any case that validation would not catch here for the gateway listeners sharing the same port?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I
Okay.
definitely agree with you that about validation, because I think you're right. I think you're right that earlier in the pipeline, you can catch the error, the better off the whole system is.
Yeah.
So I think when I was originally thinking through the conflicts, I wasn't thinking about it really in terms of validation. I was thinking of more in terms of a controller doing this validation like after the fact.
Yeah.
So if we can fix it in validation on admission, then yeah, we're way better off.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Rob, just to make sure I understand this use case, this is multiple routes that have the same host name, right? That matches.
Yeah, so this would be host name, and so host name is optional on routes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if either way, if they have the same host name or no host name or whatever it happens to be, but they both match the same request,
Gotcha.
maybe that's a clear way of stating that. But multiple routes could both conceivably match the same request, and they're both equally specific. Either they both have a host name match and a path match, or they both have a nil host name and just a path match, whatever it happens to be. If they are equally specific, it's less clear what to do here. You could just round robin and say, well, they equally match. That certainly fits the principle of don't break things that are working, just whatever. An original proposed solution was, if they are equally specific, just send traffic to the oldest route. But that can result in breaking things unexpectedly. But it's arguable, right? Because you're breaking things unexpectedly, but with everything, if you only break things halfway, then it just potentially takes longer to notice, why are half of my requests going bad? Like, it's not all of my requests got broken, but half of them are now broken. What did I change? And I guess you could figure it out. So. Okay, so I'll move on to my last, well, no, this is not the last one, but this is likely the most confusing, most terrible one that I don't know what to do with. Let's imagine that there is a route with that is in some form invalid. I don't think it's going to be common that a route is fully invalid, or else it wouldn't have made it through. Maybe if we have proper validation, this is a non-issue actually. I'm trying to think of anything that could get past route validation but would be considered invalid for a specific implementation. But maybe this is solved. Maybe a lot of this is solved just with better validation.
What about unsupported resource types? So you have your route selector, selects a bunch of things, or you specify your routes. Oh no, that would all. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
now
because
that,
because you know the resource type up front when you're specifying
yeah,
the selector, so that can't. That can be done at the gateway, not at the route.
yeah, yeah. Okay, well maybe this really all could be solved with validation, better validation. I need to spend the time to look through all the different ways that a route could potentially be invalid and then confirm that they can actually be solved with validation. There may be some things, some extension points that, as an example, we can't validate because we can't consistently prevent extension points from existing, but they may not be valid for every implementation. So maybe this comes into play there where there's some implementation specific things that are not valid for that on that route.
You could maybe that could happen in a route match if you have an extension ref and the extension ref is supported. You have a bunch of routes with different extension refs, and your controller recognizes some of them but not others.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Okay, so the next one is one of the things that I referred to as being entirely valid. Multiple gateways target the same route. I think that is entirely valid. I did want to cover it because it could be seen as a potential conflict, so we probably at least need some documentation around this being a valid and expected use case. And additionally, though this I'm not as sure about, we may want to consider some way to communicate on a route which gateways have selected that route and are currently using that route. My concern with any kind of status condition like that is it's really hard to garbage collect that without always having an omnipresent view of every route in a cluster and consistently diffing them. I feel like that, like if a route selector changes and the controller happened to be down or something like that, maintaining this gets messy. I'm not as sure about that as a form of a condition, but it was potentially useful. All right, so the next one I wanted to cover was a gateway class. These are messy. These have always been messy and confusing, and I apologize as the person who pushed for these being added to begin with. There's two gateway class fields that are really authorization fields more than anything. Allowed gateway namespaces and allowed route namespaces. They have been, at least from the initial feedback I've gotten, they have been confusing to implement or difficult to implement. And a potential solution would be to change their behavior significantly so that they would only apply as gateways are being created. They would be more, dare I say, RBAC-like or authorization-like, in that because they're authorization type fields, they refer to be what can be done at that point in time. So where you can create gateway namespaces, gateways, which namespaces can have gateways created with this gateway class. That gets messy. It assumes that gateway class is immutable. I think it is. I think we've already made that assumption. But all of this is pushing back to this idea of if you can push things away from controller specific logic and move it to creation specific validation, you get a much cleaner, much simpler user experience. So in that case, you would have to either rename the field or redocument it or something. But if it instead of limiting allowed gateway namespaces at that, forever, it limits where gateways can be created with that gateway class, and that's it. It may make the field easier. It definitely makes implementation easier. And I think it makes the user experience a little bit cleaner. Did that concept make any sense? I know I kind of jumbled through that idea.
Yeah, I feel like the concept makes sense. I'm not sure if it's a good idea.
Yeah.
If things, because it seems like you would want to, it seems like a reason you would change, you could change this stuff, and because they're just fields in the spec, then you would change
Yeah,
it,
so
but nothing would happen.
yes, right, exactly. And so you would have to, if you made this change in behavior, you would also have to rename the field or redocument the field or something to make it clear that this affects new gateways. That's it. One of the really dangerous things about this field as it exists right now and it has its spec right now is it can have disastrous impacts. Like it is potentially the most destructive field we have right now, where if someone just messes that up a little bit, they can completely, if it were followed to the spec right now, it would completely invalidate every gateway using that class, just if they accidentally made one change. And I don't think that's really the intent of the field. I think the intent of a field like this is to prevent where gateways of a certain class can be created. And so if you prevent creation, it's really quite simple to go through and check where gateways are using this class. And if you change that in the future, you can go through and clean up those gateways on your own time in a safer way. If you really don't want gateways and all these other namespaces with this class. But allowing that to happen based on a single field change in one place feels especially dangerous, and I think this same concept kind of applies to a lot of gateway class concepts. The potential blast radius of changes to gateway class is significant.
So if I wanted to turn down a gateway in this use case, if I wanted to turn down a gateway, I'd actually have to remove, let's say, it's just kind of reverse order, remove any of the routes, remove the gateway, and then I can go and update the gateway class and remove the allowed namespace that I was using for that particular gateway. That would be allowed, right?
So that is what currently would be needed to do it safely in the current spec. What I'm talking about here is removing any change, like making this field only affect future creations of gateways. And so changing this field would not invalidate any existing gateways under this proposal. That's what I'm trying to avoid. That's what I think is really dangerous here. If you can, by changing one field, invalidate a huge line of gateways. I feel
so
like
in that scenario that I just posed, the last step of going into the gateway class and removing the namespace, that wouldn't be allowed. That namespace from the gateway class's perspective would always need to be allowed.
so sorry, yeah. you can change that at any point, but all it's going to do again with this new proposal is it would affect future creation of gateways. That's it. It would not invalidate anything existing. So you can change that immediately and it's safe. It just means no one can create a new gateway outside of this updated, more restrictive list of gateway namespaces. That's all it does. It doesn't invalidate anything existing. It relies on the administrator to go through and clean up their own resources on their own time safely. That's the theory.
Okay, I mean, and then you could imagine some sort of garbage collection scheme,
Right.
in conjunction with that.
Right. Yeah. It's very possible to do garbage collection or whatever else to automate that. I really hate for that to be a gateway for that change to be part of our API, to basically have a single change have such a huge blast radius and potential impact. But yeah. So I know we're really over time here, but thank you everyone for the feedback here. It's been really helpful. I'll try and get some updates in. I think Harry may have something to present tomorrow, and and if there is any extra time, I may follow up with the last few things I have in this doc tomorrow as well. Yeah, thank you guys so much. This has been very helpful.
Thanks a lot, Rob.
Yeah, thanks for putting that together.
All right. Thanks. See you.
Bye.